Well, I hope you guys had a great day. We're in for a great evening, and I'm excited to be here with you. Welcome. My name is Sean Corsandi, and I'm the Executive Director of Landmark West. We're excited to have you here for San Juan Hill Revisited, Amsterdam Houses Before and After. We're joined this evening by our Education Director, Sarah McCulley, and our Preservation Director, Megan Fitzpatrick, who will be helping us behind the scenes tonight. As you may have noticed already, tonight's presentation is being recorded and captions are currently enabled should you need them. By now, you should all be on mute and you will remain on mute throughout the presentation. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. Please feel free to jump into the chat, share your thoughts, add any questions you might have, and we can address those in the Q&A after Jessica's presentation, or you can hold off your question and ask it live following the presentation using the raise hand function below in the reactions box at the bottom of your screen, at which time we will unmute you and be happy to have you join us. So we want to give a special call out tonight to our members. Thank you for joining us. We also have a lot of people joining us from Columbia University and Fordham University. Those students, we're happy to have you. And we're also excited to have a lot of guests from Amsterdam Houses and the Amsterdam Houses edition. So welcome to all of you. We're grateful for your collective interest. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, just to introduce you to Landmark West, we are your good government grassroots organization focused on preservation, land use, and zoning concerns for the Upper West Side, essentially from 59th Street to 110th Street, Scenic Landmark Riverside Park through Scenic Landmark Central Park. This is our third public program in our ongoing commitment to telling the stories of San Juan Hill. You can find more about this neighborhood on our portal, which is landmarkwest.org/SJH, which has all of our prior recordings, our research, our census data, our maps, and our histories. Tonight is our second presentation from Jessica Larson. Her first presentation, titled Holding the Safety Net in San Juan Hill, explored the ways in which Black charity and reform initiatives shaped the landscape of San Juan Hill in the early 20th century. That presentation recording is also available on that same portal I just mentioned. More on her in a moment. We are grateful to many people tonight, not only from the local residents but also to our Landmark West board, chaired by Chair Cowley, and for the assistance of many hands, from our wonderful drawings by Becca Bram, to the research help from Sam Hightower and the Office for Metropolitan History, and especially to Ken Cobb of the New York City Municipal Archive. This project began as a digital rebuilding of the neighborhood through tax photos, streetscapes, and census data, and it's grown so much more by adding stories that bring it ever more vividly back to life. We want to thank Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine for his support. Thanks to him, we will begin sharing our first oral histories prepared by Sarah Diesdick in a few weeks. But in reality, we wouldn't be here tonight if it weren't for the generosity of our indefatigable Community 6 councilperson, Gail Brewer. Council member Gail Brewer picked up the torch on a project first funded by council member Ben Kalos and the Cultural Immigrant Initiative, who we must thank for this evening. Tonight, though, our speaker is Jessica Larson. Jessie will explore what previously existed on the site that is now occupied by the New York City Housing Authority's Amsterdam Houses, as well as the history of the housing project's development itself. Together, she will discuss the architecture of the Black built environment prior to Amsterdam Houses and the housing precedents that led to its creation. Jessica is a PhD candidate in art and architectural history at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her dissertation examines the architecture of charitable and reform institutions built in Manhattan for Black aid recipients between the Civil War and World War I, with a specific focus on how women reformers directed these designs. Jessica has held fellowships at the American Council of Learned Societies, the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the Library of Congress. She's also worked for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Princeton University Art Museum, and the Bruce Museum. Jessica is currently a fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Museum of American History. She's broadcasting to us from DC, and a warm welcome back to the Upper West Side, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you so much to everyone else at Landmark West. I am so happy to be back and speaking about this and so excited about all of the cool, awesome, really important work you are all doing on this topic. Tonight, I am going to talk about the history of San Juan Hill and more specifically, what existed prior to the construction of NYCHA's Amsterdam houses. As you'll see, the creation of the Amsterdam houses by the New York City Housing Authority was partially an outgrowth of existing low-income housing initiatives that had been operating in San Juan Hill since the first years of the 20th century. Though the Amsterdam houses and NYCHA projects kind of more broadly were a result of New Deal thought on how best to counter the devastating effects of the Great Depression, the birth of these ideas can be traced back to privately funded initiatives developed during the Progressive era. I'll also touch on how this urban planning program intersected with the creation of Lincoln Center in the 1950s and 60s. So this talk will consider the sort of projects that were destroyed by the creation of the Amsterdam houses, but also the precedents in San Juan Hill that paved the way for these sort of federally funded large-scale public housing projects to proliferate mid-century. I'm going to start kind of at the end, so to speak, and work backwards. The Amsterdam houses were completed in 1948, though clearing the site began in 1941. The Amsterdam houses, the superblock that the Amsterdam houses encompasses spans the area bounded by Amsterdam Avenue to the east and West End Avenue, or 11th Avenue to the west, then West 61st Street to the south, and West 64th Street to the north. The New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA as we know it more popularly, was created in 1934 and was sort of a legal follow-up to something called the 1926 Limited Dividend Housing Companies Act, which paved the way for private developers to be granted property tax abatements with the agreement that these corporations' profits would be limited annually to 6%. This, as I'm going to discuss later, was an outgrowth of low-income housing experience earlier in the century. And some of the most crucial of these sort of projects were actually in San Juan Hill. Though most public housing built in New York City was about post-war, there were several projects built in the 1930s. The first was built in 1935 in the East Village. The second was the Harlem River houses, kind of most famously. And the third was the Williamsburg houses. So while the Amsterdam houses were not among the very first that were built in the city, they were built and planned while NYCHA was still very much experimenting, and as such were still greatly influenced by measures introduced during the Progressive era regarding partnerships between public and private interests in housing development. And when I say the Progressive era, I mean, it's a very complicated term, but I'm roughly, just for our purposes, referring to the time period between about 1890 to the 1920s, when social reform, privately organized reform institutions began to proliferate. Sorry, my clicker is being weird. But we can roughly compare what is there now, the area that Amsterdam houses encompasses, and what was there when San Juan Hill was the most significant Black neighborhood in Manhattan. The area that the Amsterdam houses replaced was largely comprised of housing, but not entirely. In 1958, when urban renewal plans continued to target the area as part of the proposal for Lincoln Center, a New York Times columnist described the neighborhood as, quote, a barren waste, old law tenements stand, blousy and run down in silent shoulder-to-shoulder misery, full of filth and vermin. So very nice. While by the 1950s, it would be naive to claim that the area wasn't in severe decline, I'm going to begin by considering the institutions and buildings that existed there and try to kind of complicate this narrative that it was this like site of just like totally impoverished residents. In the late 19th century, these blocks between West 61st and West 64th Streets were not nearly as developed. This map here on the, oh shoot. I'm sorry, something is wrong with my, and I can't go back. Okay, here we go. I'm sorry. In the late 19th century, these blocks between West were not nearly developed. This map here on the left is something, or on the right is something called a fire insurance map. Beginning in the mid-19th century, insurance companies had these maps created that recorded the details of the built environment. These various colors that you can see here indicate building materials. A whole host of other information is included, but for us, it's important to just kind of note that what we're looking at, like this image here, is a view from above. We can see that the outline or footprint of the buildings, which actually tells us quite a lot, is, the shape from above of what these buildings looked like. The shape of these buildings tells us essentially that they're tenements. If we look here, we can see that this gap here indicates that they were built between about 1879 and 1901, when legislation mandated that the air shafts between tenements conform to essentially this shape. They're called dumbbell tenements, or dumbbell air shafts, because the shaft looked like this. Well, it kind of looks like a dumbbell. This was certainly an improvement over various tenement legislation that barely regulated the designs of these residential buildings and thus were very unsafe, they're unhealthy, and just generally poor places to live. So if we then look at these tenements, you can see that the air shaft is pretty small, and even these ones, which is also around the same area where Amsterdam houses became, are actually even smaller. They're not doing a whole lot of heavy lifting in terms of access to fresh air or natural light, and were probably very unpleasant places to live. San Juan Hill was popularly known for having this really outdated, outmoded housing. One of the reasons that Black residents of New York, who were generally much poorer than white New Yorkers, were able to even afford to live and migrate to San Juan Hill was because it was one of the very few places in the city by the early 20th century that they could actually afford to live. Further in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, regardless of actual financial status, Black tenants faced widespread housing discrimination. The general rule, as famous reform photographer Jacob Riis relayed, was that white tenants would not share a building with Black tenants, and white tenants would not rent in a building that had previously been rented to Black tenants. So landlords very often refused to rent to Black families, and as a result, Black tenants often lived in worse conditions than their kind of white counterparts, even if they were kind of a higher socioeconomic status than poor whites. San Juan Hill was also popularly known for its frame housing. And when I say frame housing, I mean wood, which was sometimes relics of when the area was really very rural or kind of suburban, as we might think of it today. And frame housing was used particularly for things like farmhouses. If we look here, the yellow that you see kind of covering this area indicates frame construction. Beginning mid-19th century, because of the threat of fire, frame construction was outlawed on Manhattan Island. So looking at this map from 1892, we know that these yellow buildings date back to before 1866, when frame construction was outlawed. You can see too that there are a lot of buildings marked as things like factory or stable or coal yard. These are the sort of things that were generally built a bit farther from the dense urban center. The green buildings indicate that these were buildings with hazardous or dangerous features that were often likely to start fires. This could be buildings like bakeries, because bakeries have ovens, manufacturers, breweries, or slaughterhouses, very commonly slaughterhouses in the 19th century. Stables tended to smell really bad and could also be a frequent cause of fires because of the use of hay. So they were usually a bit distant from where at least the more middle class or wealthy lived. If you owned a horse, you'd probably board it at a stable a bit far from where you lived. So if you were living downtown and were upper class or middle class, you might board your stable, or you might board your horse in a stable in somewhere like San Juan Hill. So factories or any other sort of industrial work were very loud and produced air pollution, so they were also not particularly desirable places to live near. Well into the 20th century, once San Juan Hill was in full swing, the area was still notoriously loud and filled with fumes and smoke. In 1902, construction began on the Interborough Rapid Transit Company Powerhouse, or IRT Powerhouse, between 58th Street and 59th Street, West End Avenue, and 12th Avenue. designed by the famous architect Sanford White, who also designed such structures as the Washington Square Park Arch or the Boston Public Library. The massive station powered the city's original subway lines. The station, which at one point produced more electricity than any other plant in the world, was very loud. Reportedly, you could hear the turbines for blocks surrounding the station, and the coal dust constantly billowing from its smokestacks was constantly hanging in the air. So this is all to say that at the turn of the century, San Juan Hill was not the most desired place to live. The housing was old, outdated, and dangerous, and the environment was very loud and unhealthy. In fact, just jumping ahead a little bit, the area was so notoriously polluted and unhealthy that in 1901, the city made plans to construct one of the first municipal bathhouses in the area, built on West 60th Street between Amsterdam and West End Avenues, so right around the corner from where Amsterdam Houses is now. This bathhouse was intended to alleviate the horrible conditions caused in part by the IRT powerhouse. Also, according to the newspaper The Sun, the antagonisms between San Juan Hill's Black and white adolescents, mostly Irish and Italian, but there were actually reportedly quite a lot of Jewish attendees to this bathhouse. The interracial nature of it led to the site being a place of huge racial tension and animosity, and then de facto segregation, in spite of the fact that when this public bathhouse was originally planned, the intention was mostly to serve the neighborhood's Black residents. The bathhouse opened in 1906 and featured for the first time in the city something called a plunge, or today we would call this a swimming pool. This large pool could fit about 250 swimmers and offered women's only swimming about 3 days a week, which sounds great. While the swimming pool was pretty novel at the time, it eventually became the main attraction as apartments or model tenements in the neighborhood became legally required to include bathing facilities in the buildings. So the actual bathing component of this building kind of gets phased out, and people really become attracted to the swimming pool, the novelty of the swimming pool. And just as a note, if you still want to visit, it is still open and run by the Parks Department today. But still in 1900, the area was not super densely populated. It was still pretty heavily white as well. The Black population was rising, however, and some blocks were already essentially entirely Black, such as West 63rd and West 64th Streets between West End and Amsterdam Avenues. Most Black residents were migrants from the South, though there were also residents who had immigrated from the West Indies. After Southern slavery was abolished in 1865, formerly enslaved people began migrating to the North to escape emerging Jim Crow laws and find better opportunities, particularly after the fallout of the end of Reconstruction. This was not nearly as significant of a geographical shift as the later Great Migration, but it was still impactful and really visibly changed the racial landscape of New York. Between 1865 and 1900, the Black population in New York actually more than doubled. Before San Juan Hill became the most important Black neighborhood in the city, before Harlem at least, a neighborhood called the Tenderloin District was the most popularly recognized Black neighborhood in Manhattan. No one at the time could seemingly agree on the exact boundaries of this neighborhood. Sometimes it sort of gets lumped in with San Juan Hill, but it was essentially where Chelsea is today, with the highest concentration of Black residents living in the West 20s and West 30s, between 6th and 7th Avenues usually. Between about 1800 and 1900, this was where most Black New Yorkers settled. Essentially, two things precipitated the move from the Tenderloin to San Juan Hill, though. Firstly, the construction of Penn Station, which destroyed hundreds of Black homes, as well as Black businesses and institutions, and increasing violence against Black Tenderloiners, either perpetrated by or tacitly sanctioned by the police. As well, with the continual rise of immigration from Europe, Blacks were gradually forced farther uptown, gradually as years went on, and as they competed for space with white immigrants who were moving into the Tenderloin. These factors, combined with the rise of immigration from the West Indies in the first decade of the 20th century, were what led to San Juan Hill becoming such a significant center of Black life and cultural development. The first institution founded by and for Black San Juan Hill residents was Union Baptist Church, originally at 202 West 63rd Street. Union Baptist was established in 1898 by Reverend George Sims. Sims was born in Virginia to formerly enslaved parents. He moved north and very improbably earned an engineering degree while he worked as an elevator operator in Manhattan. He first founded Union Baptist in rented storefronts, gradually raising the money to construct a dedicated building. In 1901, this was finally achieved, and this building here at 202 West 63rd Street was built. Originally, it was only 3 stories. You can see there's a 4th story that was added later. You might think that this really does not look like what you expect a church to look like, and that was kind of intentional. Sims envisioned this space as more a space that facilitated reform work or social work or any sort of social services for fellow Black migrants from the South than primarily a worship space. So in New York, in the turn of the century, very few options existed to help newcomers to the city, and even fewer were Black run. There were a few in the Tenderloin, but those too had been massively impacted by both racial violence, police brutality, and the construction of Penn Station. It isn't entirely clear exactly which services Union Baptist offered in this building at first, but they were probably a mix of childcare, an employment agency, and adult classes. These would have been pretty standard initiatives, and the space was likely designed to be multi-purpose with movable walls so that the rooms could be adapted depending on the need. But by 1904, the church had raised enough funds to purchase the lots beside their building at 204 to 206 West 63rd Street. Ambitiously, they hired architect James Riley Gordon, better known for his Texas courthouse buildings, if you happen to be familiar with those. But he designed a dedicated church building for Union Baptist. This building, which was rather large, was masonry construction, and essentially resembled what we do expect a church building to look like. I do particularly like the architect's elevation drawings, this one here in the center, because they emphasize the slope of the streets in San Juan Hill, which were a notorious feature of the neighborhood's landscape. This steep incline was a constant source of worry, particularly for parents who feared that their children would hurt themselves playing in the streets because of it. It also was a factor in the poor quality of housing in the area. It also relates to some theories as to how the neighborhood got the name San Juan Hill, though that's sort of debatable. More often, contemporary sources claim that the name alluded to probably the dangerous nature of the area, as if it were kind of akin to the Battle of San Juan Hill from the Spanish-American War, although at the time, there were constantly debated or referenced ideas about where the name came from, so that is not definitive. But with this new church built, Union Baptist was able to give over the building at 202 West 63rd Street more fully to charitable and reform work, while they used the other one for worship. In 1895, Union Baptist partnered with not 1895, in 1905, Union Baptist partnered with an organization called the New York Free Kindergarten Association for Colored Children, who had previously been operating out of a rented storefront on West 60th Street, and before that, a row house. This childcare organization was run by both Black and white women who wanted to forge an interracial institution dedicated to children's welfare, regardless of race. The kindergarten served children 5 years old and younger, which I realize doesn't really align with what we consider the ages for kindergarten today, but this was at the moment when ideas about early childhood education were very much still developing. They did offer afternoon classes for older children, though. If a mother were to place her child in the care of the kindergarten, she'd be expected to bring them to the building's reception room on the 2nd story. Located by 7 a.m., they'd have to be washed, fed, and dressed. These emerging kindergartens, there were many throughout the city, but mostly for white children, were very controversial, which seems a little odd to us today, but it was argued that they essentially facilitated mothers' ability to work outside the home, away from children. While, of course, today this is, not the most shocking thing. This was sort of new territory for reformers as well as mothers who generally came from for reformers who came from middle class or even upper class backgrounds and were often very ignorant of the choices working poor mothers had to make. So the creation of this childcare institution in San Juan Hill, where many mothers had no choice but to work long, labor-intensive day jobs like as laundresses or domestic servants, this must have been a huge lifeline for them, who were able to have childcare during the day while still being able to provide for their families with work outside the home. As Union Baptist was establishing themselves as the most important center for outreach in the neighborhood, other charitable and reform endeavors were getting off the ground as well. Since about the 1890s, so there were some earlier experiments in this, structures called model tenements were being built throughout the city. These residential buildings were generally funded by philanthropists in an effort to combat the abysmal housing conditions that plagued the city's rising immigrant population. The idea behind the initiative was that poor housing essentially breeds bad behavior and criminality. This is a concept we often refer to as environmental determinism. Philanthropists who have funded the construction of these buildings very much had their own agendas. They were designed around business models that promised to turn a modest profit for shareholders. This was usually somewhere in the realm of 3 to 5% profit each year. Sometimes you might see it referred to as 5% philanthropy. So it wasn't an enormous amount by any means, but the intention was more ideological than financial. Philanthropists and reformers thought that this was this sort of housing model offered to poor tenants something aspirational, i.e., that housing wasn't a handout, essentially. One leading reformer named Josephine Shaw Lowell summed the idea up as essentially teaching the poor how to live. And this translated too into how the model tenements were run. Generally, the management companies that ran model tenements would hire women to manage the buildings, which required them to collect rent from each tenant. Back then, it was more standard to pay rent once a week rather than once a month. So these women managers, called women collectors usually, would go to each tenant to collect the rent and often inspect the tenants' apartments. They would give probably, I am assuming, unsolicited advice, particularly to the women tenants who were expected to be in charge of their domestic realm, on anything ranging from properly cleaning the apartment, how to best arrange their furniture, or even how to best care for their children. It was very invasive and widely disliked by tenants who found it demeaning and disciplinary. In fact, many of them kind of often refused and would insist on going to the main office to pay rent to try to get around this. But in short, this is the idea behind model tenements. Yes, they provided much better housing than standard rental buildings, but the impetus behind them was filled with condescension and sort of naive expectations by the wealthy regarding why the poor were in the situations that they were in. Also, I should add, model tenements weren't really for the truly poor, not the truly destitute. They were usually cheaper than other apartments, but kind of not by much. Rather, tenants were generally working poor, but stable or upwardly mobile in some kind of a small degree. These same sort of criticisms, of course, would later be leveled against NYCHA policies as well. In 1901, San Juan Hill's first model tenement was built at 213 to 215 West 62nd Street. Called the Tuskegee, this model tenement was remarkable in that it was reserved exclusively for Black tenants. This building, which spanned 2 lots and was 6 stories and a basement, had 48 apartments and 140 rooms total. Steam heat and hot water were also provided, which was very novel at the time, and was built with the latest fire prevention methods. The one who really spearheaded this project and designed the architectural plans was a man named Isaac Newton Phelps Stokes. Kind of a funny name, but he is more commonly referred to I.N. Phelps Stokes. Some of you might have heard of him before. He wrote a really foundational and very lengthy history of Manhattan Island. Phelps Stokes himself was a trained architect and he was a very wealthy heir. The Phelps-Stokes family had made their fortune in the early 19th century in mercantile and mining businesses. The family had, and actually continued to have well into the 20th century, a unique interest in funding projects to assist Black Americans, as well as funding for certain initiatives in Africa. Actually, Ian Phelps-Stokes's grandfather, James Boulter Stokes, had funded the creation of what we can consider the city's first model tenement, called the Working Men's Home, which was built in 1855 between Elizabeth and Mott Streets. This, like the later Tuskegee, was exclusively for the city's Black residents. It definitely was not designed as well as the Tuskegee. It was also 6 stories, brick, listed as nearly fireproof, whatever that means. Each unit had its own kitchen, pantry, bedroom, and small parlor. Like later model tenements, there was a variety of apartment layouts, so rent depended on size and number of rooms. There was also a space for drying racks in the basement, and hallways had individual closets for each unit to be able to store their stuff. There was also fresh water available, and the halls were lit by gaslight. I know all of this sounds very standard for us today, but in 1855, this is pretty novel housing. The top floor was just a large room used for activities like Sunday school classes, concerts, or lectures. There were pretty strict moral and hygienic codes that tenants were expected to follow. So essentially, it was a pretty clear precursor to model tenements, both formally and ideologically. Unfortunately, despite its reportedly being quite a success, the Working Men's Home was sold off to a private investor 12 years later, and at that point no longer rented to Black tenants. Regardless, it was this sort of history and framework through which Ian Phelps-Stokes later was thinking about ways in which better housing design and business models could help improve conditions for Manhattan's Black poor. In the 1890s, when the city was considering new options for housing regulation, Ian Phelps-Stokes was on the committee tasked with presenting new designs for residential buildings, and he co-authored the new tenement house law in 1901, which was the one that kind of I mentioned it earlier, but it required all of these new sort of safety and health regulations that really form the basis for how housing policy has kind of operated since. And the Tuskegee's plans were the first submitted to the city once that law was passed. The project was mainly financed by his aunts, Olivia and Caroline Phelps-Stokes. The sisters, they're actually very interesting figures themselves. Neither ever married, and they were very independent for their time. They used their fortunes to fund a lot of sort of radical initiatives, or at least radical for the early 20th century. Caroline in particular was a friend of activist Booker T. Washington, the main figure behind the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. The Tuskegee Institute was founded in 1881 as one of the few higher education institutions for Black students in the country. Washington's approach to Black education was controversial then, and historians have generally been pretty critical of it since. The Tuskegee Institute emphasized training in technical and manual trades like carpentry or agricultural work. So in other words, trades that were stable and could reliably lead to employment, but essentially didn't offer much promise of class advancement or entrance into white-collar work. This concept has often been referred to as accommodationism by historians who feel that Washington and Tuskegee essentially did not adequately seek to challenge the systemic nature of white supremacy, and essentially offered a model that ensured Black students, once they graduated with their trades, would sort of always be subservient to their white employers. Caroline and Olivia Phelps-Stokes funded the construction of many buildings on the Tuskegee campus. So I'm not positive who proposed that the Tuskegee model tenement be named after the Tuskegee Institute, but I think it's reasonable to guess it was the Phelps-Stokes sisters, given their financial involvement as well as close relationship to the Tuskegee Institute. That they would honor Washington and his mission at the Tuskegee Institute speaks to how these wealthy white philanthropists viewed the kind of mission and purpose of structures like the Tuskegee model tenement. It was a project dedicated to improving the conditions of the Black poor, but it was still something inherently disciplinary that sought to conform Black tenants to white expectations of propriety and middle-class modes of living. It was also a way for the wealthy to control the impact of poverty on Manhattan's built environment, kind of on their own terms. This wasn't the only model tenement built for Black tenants, funded by the Phelps-Stokes family in San Juan Hill. Spanning the 3 lots directly behind the Tuskegee on West 63rd Street, the Hampton model tenement was built in 1912. This much larger model tenement was 128 apartments for rent and was 6 stories and a basement as well. Like the Tuskegee, this was also designed by I.M. Phelps-Stokes, and also like the Tuskegee, this model tenement was named for a Black institution for higher education, the Hampton Institute in Virginia. The Hampton Institute was often likened to a sister institution to the Tuskegee Institute. Like the Tuskegee, the Hampton was similarly criticized as regressive and accommodating of white efforts to keep Black workers in menial trades. Interestingly, the Hampton model tenements construction was actually very entangled in Black-directed efforts toward labor organizing and racial uplift. After lobbying from prominent Black reformers in the neighborhood, the Hamptons planners agreed to hire Black workers in the construction process. So in a way, it was sort of a success of Black organized labor. Interestingly, too, Reverend George Sims of Union Baptist actually moved into the Hampton once it was opened. You can see from the footprints of the Tuskegee and Hampton that they were designed differently. I haven't been able to find floor plans for the Hampton, and I do have one for the Tuskegee, but it's very poor quality and very small. It's very difficult to make out, particularly on a screen like this. With when I look at it, I have to use a magnifying glass. So I'm not putting it here because it's just kind of useless. But these are essentially plans that very likely corresponded to what these buildings were designed by. They often followed a pretty standard formula, so it's not too hard to make guesses. Importantly, these new model tenements were designed to take up multiple lots, so they're a lot bigger than standard rental buildings. This was in keeping with efforts to include more light, fresh air, and fire prevention in the plans. You can see in this plan, which corresponds to what I expect Hampton's design to have followed, that the stairwells are exposed and located off the interior courtyard. Between 1901, when the Tuskegee was built, and 1912, when the Hampton was built, this plan became more favorable for architects. These exposed stairwells were considered much better for fire prevention and safety. So this is all to say that the designs of these model tenements in San Juan Hill were keeping up with current trends in housing design, and the funders and model tenement societies governing their construction were genuinely seeking to provide adequate housing to tenants. Also, given that the Tuskegee was the first building whose plans were submitted to the city following the new tenement design guidelines, it seems as though architects like I.M. Phelps-Stokes were using the development of San Juan Hill to kind of experiment with new architectural ideas, kind of using it as a laboratory of sorts to test new innovations in building design. There were 2 more model tenements built in the neighborhood, which still stand today, actually, and were not destroyed to make way for the Amsterdam houses. I'll return to those later, but sticking with buildings that did have to later be cleared for the public housing project, I want to discuss an institution that ideologically aligned in many ways with the project of model tenements, the Henrietta Industrial School. This building was sited at 224 to 226 West 63rd Street, directly next to the Hampton model tenement. This building was 4 stories and a basement. It was originally built in around 1890, when, again, the neighborhood was much less developed. Actually, I think it might have been the first building built on the block, or at least one of the first. And there was significantly lower Black population at that point. It was actually originally built to serve as essentially a workhouse for recently released convicts. This didn't last too long. I'm not exactly sure why, but my guess is that because the neighborhood was kind of pretty rapidly developing and pretty rapidly becoming residential, it was decided that it was not in the neighborhood's best interest to have such an institution located in a residential area. These sort of things would usually be a little bit farther away from, the life of the city. In 1891, an organization called the Children's Aid Society purchased the building. The Children's Aid Society was one of the most prominent reform organizations in not just New York City, but by the early 20th century, it's one of the most important in the country. Some of you have probably heard of them because they were and are notorious for something called the Placing Out program, also commonly referred to as the Orphan Train program. In short, this was a program wherein any inner city children were sent to families in the countryside throughout the United States. The idea was that by sending children off to these rural families, they'd escape the corrupting influence of the city and also kind of learn labor skills, because usually they would be placed on farms. In reality, these children were often or sometimes taken without their parents' permission and essentially served as free exploited labor far from home. And just as a note, I realize as I'm saying this that it might be sort of this term orphan might be sort of confusing because I just said that the parents might not give permission. The 19th century, early 20th century definition of orphan is a little different than we think of it today. We now associate it with children whose parents are both deceased. At the time, it was more applied to children whose parents either just could not care for them, and that might be a temporary situation, or maybe one parent is deceased, but it didn't necessarily mean that their parents were deceased. This program of placing children out and taking them out to the countryside isn't what is happening at the Henrietta Industrial School, but that gives you an idea of the sort of coercive, insensitive practices that often define the Children's Aid Society's work. After the Children's Aid Society took over the building, it was first used as an industrial school for children in the neighborhood, though no records seem to indicate that this included Black children. Generally, Black children were not welcome to attend the Children's Aid Society schools throughout the city. The founder was pretty openly racist. You might be wondering what an industrial school is. This was essentially the sort of education offered at places like the Tuskegee or Hampton Institutes, i.e. it was work, albeit in this case for adolescents, not adults, that prioritized manual trades. Sometimes children would be compelled to attend industrial schools by the courts. They sometimes served as a sort of precursor to juvenile hall today, though that is certainly not always the case. After the head of the Children's Aid Society, a man named Charles Loring Brace, noticed that San Juan Hill had an unusually high number of disabled children. The Henrietta's building was renovated to better accommodate classes for these kids in about 1898. This included outfitting it with special bathing facilities for them, massage equipment to alleviate pain, and desks and chairs better suited for them. Also, if you look at this photo, you can actually, it's not in this photo, sorry. I'll go back for a moment. If you look at this photo, you can see this gate on the side of the building to the left. This was something called a horse walk, which allowed horses and their carriages to pass through the rear of the building's lot. When the school began catering to disabled children, they purchased a small horse-drawn wagon or wagonette that could pick up children from their homes in the morning and drop them back off at home in the afternoon. This wagon had a glass cover to protect the children from the harsh weather of the winter months. There wasn't a stable on site. The horses were boarded at a stable elsewhere in the neighborhood, just returning to the stable theme. I'm not sure exactly when the Henrietta shifted to almost exclusively serve Black children, but in the first few years of the 20th century, the institution began to be listed as one specifically for San Juan Hills Black children. Classes at the Henrietta were deeply gendered. Girls would learn skills like domestic service, laundry work, cooking, sewing, things like that. Boys learned trades like carpentry, cobbling, riflery, etc. Boys tended to have more recreational activities offered to them. You can see in these photos, boys very happily, engage. In this middle photo, boys are actually this, I believe, was part of their forget if it was riflery or their musical practice, but there are other photos if you want to check out the New York Historical Society's archives of boys very gleefully having a good time learning musical instruments and riflery and other games. The Henrietta Industrial School was entirely white run, but there were ways in which Black neighborhood residents were able to exert some influence over the institution. Beginning in the first decade of the 20th century, Black immigration from the West Indies began to increase, and many of these immigrants settled in San Juan Hill, where there was already this established network of Black support. In 1904, a group of Black West Indian immigrants who belonged to the Moravian denomination of Protestantism approached the Henrietta to convince them to allow for a portion of the building to be adapted into a church, and a church and a social reform center for the group. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find any specifics regarding where exactly in the building that was. I have definitely found no photographs, although I would sure love to. But they were successful, and the group founded the Third Moravian Church in the building and became a center. While the institution was white run, they were able to kind of leverage the center in for arriving immigrants from the West Indies. I'm going to take a detour here and return to the Henrietta in a moment, but just thinking about the larger landscape of San Juan Hill that was destroyed during the mid-century West Side renewal efforts, other institutions significant to Black immigrant history were also leveled. An example of this was the St. Cyprian's Parish House and Chapel. I won't delve too deeply into it because it doesn't directly pertain to the later creation of the Amsterdam houses, but I do think it's important to discuss in relation to the neighborhood's really dynamic and complex history. As West Indian immigrants began to move into the neighborhood, the city's Episcopal diocese, of course, which was all white, acknowledged that there was this growing need for worship spaces and social centers for the large numbers of West Indian Episcopalians that were coming into the city. And I'll note that this isn't really, it's not the first impressive Black Episcopalian institution in New York City. In 1895, St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, which some of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with today because it is such an important institution in Harlem, but they were a Black congregation, and they built this structure for charitable work on West 30th Street. For a Black congregation to fund the construction of such a building, it's architect design, purpose-built. You can see here it's quite large. It's a beautiful building. In the 19th century, this was really a remarkable and kind of unthinkable achievement. So the diocese recognized how successful this endeavor had been and conceded to calls by the city's Black Episcopalians to create another institution more specific to arriving West Indian immigrants. And also, just as a note, unfortunately, this building here on West 30th Street didn't last too long because while it was built in 1895, Penn Station came pretty soon after. And so it was demolished in, I think, 1910, so that offices could be built on its site to serve Penn Station. But back to St. Cyprian's, construction began in 1905, though this initially just began in renovated row houses. In 1907, though this purpose-built building here was constructed, this institution served a lot of purposes and adapted to the neighborhood's changing needs and as the immigrant population grew. And as a note, they, of course, did not just serve West Indian immigrants. Actually, the Reverend and his wife, like George Sims at Union Baptist, had migrated from Virginia, and they very publicly wanted to impress a message that while the focus was West Indian immigrants, the center was open to all. So like the Henrietta, the St. Cyprian's offered industrial training classes, though on a smaller scale. They also paid neighborhood women to do laundry and men to work in the institution's printing press. Maybe most importantly, though, was the milk station located in the church's or the institution's basement. Milk stations were developed in the late 19th century as innovations in pasteurized milk, as well as increased scientific awareness of the importance of babies having clean milk grew. Milk stations offered either free or cheap pasteurized milk and early types of formula to needy mothers. After St. Cyprian's introduced their milk station, infant mortality rates in the neighborhood dramatically decreased. The wife of St. Cyprian's Reverend, Mrs. Harriet Johnson, oversaw the milk station's operations and reported that prior to the inclusion of this milk station, her husband, Reverend Johnson, buried on average 1 Black infant every other day, which is a horrifying thought, but this number fell to a mere 6 children in 1 year, thanks to this new initiative of distributing clean or pasteurized milk. During the construction of Lincoln Center, St. Cyprian's buildings were seized by the city and used as offices for housing relocation. This photo here, published in the New York Times, shows a chaotic scene as worried tenants applied for assistance. The congregation was absorbed into the Christ and St. Stephen's Episcopal Church on West 69th Street shortly after. Returning to the Henrietta, though, by the 1920s, the concept of industrial schools had really fallen out of favor, at least in the North. They went pretty strong in the South for a number of decades. The Children's Aid Society began to transition its building into a space for healthcare services. In 1928, through a donation from John D. Rockefeller, the institution was rebranded as the Columbus Hill Community Center. Regarding this name, Columbus Hill, in the 1910s, around 1915, residents of San Juan Hill moved to have the neighborhood popularly renamed or sort of rebranded as Columbus Hill. This was an effort mostly led by reformers to escape the negative reputation or connotations attached to San Juan Hill. The newly adapted Henrietta building included a health center run by the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, a station devoted to the health of babies, a nursery, and other agencies related to child development and education. The center was quickly a success. Within its first month of existence, roughly 150 girls and 320 boys were enrolled in classes and activities, including sports, dancing, music classes, and more. As well, the building included a boys' club with more recreational activities such as a pool table. Thelonious Monk, who grew up across the street in Phipps House's No. 2 model tenement, later recounted policing younger children during these pool games at the Columbus Hill Community Center, kind of trying to keep them in line. And his mother was actually a cook at the center. So, and actually today, some of you I'm sure are aware of this, but the section of West 63rd Street that is now surrounded by Amsterdam houses has been renamed to Thelonious Monk Circle in honor of his time spent there. As it was, while still the Henrietta Industrial School, children were divided by age group and gender. In spite of the center's popularity, the Children's Aid Society announced in April of 1930 that they would be closing the institution due to lack of funding. After much vocal outcry from residents of the neighborhood who argued that the Children's Aid Society was motivated by racism and not the sort of financial concerns that they had speciously cited, the Columbus Hill Community Center remained open. In 1934, they actually added a playground, a quite large playground, to much fanfare and celebration. The Columbus Hill Community Center unfortunately closed in 1938, primarily because it had sort of outlived its original purpose. with San Juan Hill's Black population mostly migrating to Harlem by the 1930s, it had just sort of become obsolete. And I think the building had become particularly run down at that point. It probably wasn't, there probably wasn't much salvaging there. But the building was demolished as part of clearance to make way for the Amsterdam houses in 1948. And I'm sorry, I don't have a good photograph of the exterior of the building when it was converted into the Columbus Hill Health Center. I wish I did. Alongside the Columbus Hill Community Center, this area demarcated here was also leveled to make way for Amsterdam houses. You can see also these other two structures that escaped demolition. I want to make mention of them, even though they still do exist today. I had mentioned that the Tuskegee and Hampton model tenements were just 2 of the 4 model tenements built in the neighborhood. These 2 surviving buildings were the Phipps houses, number 2 and 3 model tenements. The plans for Phipps houses number 2 were announced in 1905. It was financed by Henry Phipps Jr., Andrew Carnegie's former business partner. He had very just recently left the practice. But the same year Phipps houses number 2 was announced, Phipps houses number 1 was completed on the east side. This model tenement was very much celebrated. It was designed by famous architect Grosvenor Atterbury and primarily intended for white European immigrants, mostly German immigrants. After the success of Phipps houses number 1, Henry Phipps was persuaded to fund model tenements for Black tenants on San Juan Hill by a number of reformers who would then later go on to co-found the NAACP. They're reportedly not quite as high quality as Phipps's model tenements for whites. Phipps houses 2 and 3 were apparently very fine housing, and alongside the Tuskegee and Hampton, helped shift the reputation of the neighborhood from a place of blight and deteriorating housing to this generative site for experiments in dense residential design. As well, Black reformers in the neighborhood saw the creation of these buildings as an opportunity to exert some modicum of leverage over the aims of white philanthropy. For example, the child care institution that occupied Union Baptist Church's building also convinced the funders of Phipps houses number 2 and the designers to include space for them to conduct their work in the basement of the model tenement, as well as to reserve 2 flats on the ground floor to conduct their work in as well. Today, these tenements are now market rate rentals. I think they have some openings if you're interested. And the Phipps Corporation sold these buildings off in 1961 to private interests. Why Phipps houses number 2 and 3 were not included in plans to demolish the area of NYCHA's housing project isn't entirely spelled out in any records I've seen, but I think it isn't too difficult to make an educated guess. As I had discussed earlier, the Phelps-Stokes family's funds and the professional work of I.N. Phelps-Stokes had been integral to New York City's evolving housing policies. This wasn't as true with Phipps's funded housing, though Phipps funded the construction of new low-income housing developments well into the 20th century, like the Phelps-Stokes family, and actually the organization still exists today. The Phipps Housing Organization still exists today as a nonprofit for housing development. The point was not really to direct publicly funded policy on the issue. And this is true too for numerous other philanthropists who funded model tenements throughout the city for white tenants, such as the Astor family. I.N. Phelps-Stokes, on the other hand, continued to be involved in housing legislation until his death in 1944. Not content with the 1901 Tenement House Act being his final contribution to the city's built environment, he sponsored architectural competitions to produce new innovative plans and served on public and private committees and commissions for improved housing. This extended to federal policies, and he broadly pushed for more standardized national policies and had quite actually a large influence on policy here where I am in Washington, D.C. Yeah. By the 1930s, public discussion had turned to the question of slum clearance. Though we associate the concept with figures like Robert Moses and the slightly later West Side Renewal that created Lincoln Center, this idea wasn't entirely new. For example, the same sort of rhetoric of clearing an area coded as sort of unsalvageably poor, a concentration of vice and criminality, and particularly associated with either non-white figures, or more often Black figures, was employed in the construction of Penn Station in the first decade of the 20th century as well. If you kind of read the records, the thing said to clear the area of Chelsea that Penn Station becomes, it's almost completely analogous to the sort of language Robert Moses uses later. But I.M. Phelps Stokes was in favor of the same sort of proposition and believed through his decades of experience that the best path toward affordable housing on a large scale depended on partnerships between private and public interests. NYCHA's first public housing project was the appropriately termed First Houses in the East Village. The lots had been purchased from Vincent Astor of the famous Astor family in 1935. So there was this precedent for NYCHA dealing with wealthy philanthropists to secure land for these public housing projects. The same sort of arrangement was essentially what happened later for the land on which the Tuskegee and Hampton sat. In 1933, Phelps Stokes sponsored a yet another architecture competition through the City for Affordable Housing Design, with an emphasis on the integration of park space, which had not entirely been there in the propositions he had made in the 1890s. Originally, he envisioned these sort of low-income projects to be centered around green park space, wherein privately funded developments like model tenements would be sited along the perimeter. You can kind of see it here. I know this plan is sort of hard to read, but this center is supposed to be green space. And along it, if you can see my cursor, is where the housing developments would be. Formally, this is sort of an inverse of the Towers in the Park modernist plan, which eventually became a significant influence on both publicly and privately funded dense housing. While the competition produced excellent designs, the persistent problem of budget and financing plagued the proposed models. Seemingly no plan could both include all of the stipulations of quality housing while still remaining within a reasonable range for tenants' rental prices. To Phelps Stokes, this pointed to the necessity of private investment for funding, as tax policy just couldn't be relied on to provide these high standards to tenants. Further, the issue of density was a persistent problem. NYCHA and Phelps Stokes significantly disagreed on how many tenants should be accommodated within a housing block. NYCHA's plans called for much less density than Phelps Stokes felt was necessary. He was in favor of far, far more. Of course, we should also keep in mind that Phelps Stokes, he had his own motivations. As a member of the city's ultra wealthy, it does make sense that he felt strongly about continuing to allow a certain elite subsection of the population to continue to drive policy choices, as they had done in the first decades of the 20th century. Again, while Phelps Stokes was, I actually admire Phelps Stokes quite a lot, and he was very progressive for his time. I think he still sort of fell into the pattern of the early 20th century, or arguably still today, of thinking that kind of the rich know best. Phelps Stokes, through work financed by the Phelps Stokes Fund, established by his aunts, persistently pushed the city to not just address housing, but think of the problem more holistically, meaning that whole neighborhoods needed to be addressed rather than just kind of single buildings. Thinking again of San Juan Hill, Phelps Stokes pressured NYCHA to publicly acknowledge Black tenants and employees as central figures in the movement for better housing in 1940. This was notable as segregation was still officially in place in these sort of government projects. The Phelps Stokes Fund financed studies to determine the negative effects of segregation on housing conditions, particularly within NYCHA projects, for decades. So though Phelps Stokes was quite progressive for his time in terms of race relations and concerns for structural poverty, by the time NYCHA was constructing housing on a large scale, his ideas for design had become somewhat dated. And it's kind of interesting to read the letters of the people surrounding him who kind of begin to acknowledge this reality. Through the New Deal, ideas about how affordable housing could spur more wide-scale city changes had outpaced progressive era ideas that had centered the paternalistic philanthropic efforts of wealthy white funders. New trends prioritize the development of housing alongside other community initiatives like childcare and elderly care centers. These were certainly additions to low-income housing that had been innovated in the progressive era, including in San Juan Hills model tenements, but these new NYCHA considerations foregrounded a more standardized integration of such services. This was actually in part due to the work of I.M. Phelps Stokes's wife, Edith Minturn Stokes, who was a champion of the early 20th century kindergarten movement, and alongside her husband pushed for the issues of housing and childcare to really be considered as joint issues. As well, Black women in San Juan Hill, as well as the Tenderloin, had actively pushed for the inclusion of childcare spaces in affordable housing projects, and some were instrumental in later orchestrating these plans in public housing. I have this newspaper clipping here, which kind of out of context is confusing, but it's essentially declaring that this institution called the Hope Day Nursery would be moved into NYCHA's Lincoln houses in 1948. The Hope Day Nursery was an entirely Black-run nursery, established first in the Tenderloin, but the woman who established it and ran it for years then later relocated to San Juan Hill to run operations out of Union Baptist childcare institution. So it all kind of comes full circle, but the point is that it's easy to attribute these sort of innovations and progressive policies to the wealthy women like Edith Minturn Stokes, who was very important. I'm not discrediting her, but it was also an accumulation of the efforts of women like those involved with something like the Hope Day Nursery. By the time plans for the Amsterdam houses were drawn up, the neighborhood had significantly changed since San Juan Hill had first begun to develop in about 1900. By 1940, it was no longer considered the heart of Black New York. Of course, this had shifted to Harlem by that point. You can see here in this section of the census that St. Cyprian's was still Black run, but nearly, if you kind of were to look at the census more expansively, you would see that essentially all of their neighbors were white. Still, on the blocks where the Amsterdam houses would then be built, residents were still very much overwhelmingly Black. Looking at those listed for the Tuskegee and Hampton, tenants were still Black, as model tenements were still reserved for them, though thanks to the Great Migration, the scales had sort of tipped back to a majority of Black residents hailing from either the South or actually were now their parents or even grandparents have been New Yorkers. And there were fewer, there's still very many immigrants from the West Indies by this point. In 1926, Union Baptist Church followed their congregation uptown and relocated to Harlem, where they actually are still today. Their former San Juan Hill buildings were, I believe they were rented. I don't think they sold off the building, but I'm not positive. I think they were rented to Father Divine's International Peace Mission movement in the 1930s. This controversial religious movement, sometimes deemed a cult, which was ironically against most forms of charity or welfare, used the buildings on West 63rd Street for what they called their heavens, meaning essentially kind of communal living spaces. You can see in this section of the census for those Union Baptist addresses that the names of the movement's followers were quite creative. We have beautiful beauty, peaceful ray of sunshine, grace, glory, peace. It goes on, kind of doesn't kind of adds to the idea that there's something sort of cultish about it. But anyway, this is part of the very interesting fabric of the neighborhood that was developing in the 1930s and 1940s. And of course, as made famous by West Side Story, I can't not acknowledge the very significant Puerto Rican population that had begun to occupy the neighborhood. Between 1910 and 1945, the Puerto Rican population in New York grew from just the very small number of 1,600 residents to 135,000 residents. So by the large scale of New York's population, this is kind of still a small number, but it's very visible on the West Side and a very dramatic increase. So while most Puerto Ricans who settled on the West Side were a little bit more north, beginning mostly in the West 80s than really kind of where the heart of San Juan Hill was, certainly many still lived in the West 60s and were drawn to the already strong Caribbean presence in the neighborhood. And they were, of course, also living in some of the model tenements too. Demolition began in October of 1941. This was a much celebrated event by the city and housing officials and considered an end to a negative chapter in Manhattan's history. And I'm sure it's a complex issue, and maybe the negative side was not as reported as much, but seemingly many of the residents of San Juan Hill were actually kind of happy to see this change as well. But while the proposed buildings were intended to be integrated, the Amsterdam Houses plans were intended to be integrated, the planners expected that most would still be Black families from the neighborhood. There was vigorous opposition to this. Members of the public and city government were adamantly against taxpayer-funded housing that prioritized Black tenants. Detractors said, well, why, it echoes so much of what we hear today. Why is so much money going to Black tenants instead of, the needy white tenants throughout the city? Those displaced by the construction of Amsterdam houses were offered relocation to rehabilitated properties elsewhere in the city, including some on the east side and then somewhere in Harlem. This, of course, was not ideal for West Side residents whose support networks were based in San Juan Hill. The Amsterdam houses were designed by Chief Architect Harvey Wiley Corbett, with the office of Grosvenor Atterbury's firm providing drafting support. Atterbury was a familiar figure. I had mentioned earlier that he had designed the first Phipps Houses model tenement on the east side for white tenants. In keeping with prevailing theories regarding public housing density and design, the complex had 13 buildings with 1,084 units. This comprised 10 6-story buildings and 3 13-story towers. Because the site is on San Juan Hill's famous slope, which I kind of referenced earlier, the idea was that by siting the 3 tallest towers along Amsterdam Avenue, the design effectively cordoned off the development from the chaos of the city, leaving the lower rise buildings to have an unobstructed view of the Hudson River. You can also see that in the building in the top right corner included a nursery, a clinic, and a health center. Though these plans were filed with the city in 1942, World War II stalled the development. This is why there's this gap between when the buildings are demolished in 1941 and then when they're opened in 1948. Funding gets tied up in World War II, and most kind of city projects don't get off ground for a little bit. This new complex followed the format of other public housing projects that were being built at the time. This was called the city in the park typology, similar to towers in the park plans that prioritize green space. The idea was to make these sites in a way sort of microcosms of neighborhoods wherein residents could rely on the services offered within the NYCHA complexes to serve their needs. This then was a sort of stand-in for revitalizing the NYCHA complex, this was sort of a stand-in for revitalizing an entire neighborhood. This is a persistent criticism of public housing, that it essentially creates these like islands of poverty that cut off residents from surrounding neighborhoods. Though the area of San Juan Hill in the 1940s was still low income, the construction of Lincoln Center and new housing that catered to middle-class white families changed the economic composition of the housing of the surrounding area. By the 1970s, these changes had effectively isolated the Amsterdam houses from much of the rest of the Upper West Side that was a bit more affluent. This isn't just an issue of sort of feeling socially isolated. A common complaint amongst NYCHA residents is that when their surrounding neighborhood becomes more well off, prices for basic things like groceries or other necessities rise as well. And so it makes, kind of being tethered to this area even more difficult. And indeed, when the plans for Amsterdam houses were announced, critics claimed that the project was intended to essentially restrict poor Black residents to a very geographically confined area. But this is kind of a double-edged sword. While the downside is that this type of plan often disjoints public housing projects from surrounding neighborhoods that might be higher income, the upside is that Amsterdam houses includes a number of progressive, crucial services that had previously been filled through private initiatives in San Juan Hill, such as, the Child Care Center or somewhere like St. Cyprian's. Roughly 5,000 square feet in the complex was set aside for a nursery, a health clinic, a gymnasium, and offices for other sort of community-based initiatives and adult learning classes. Today, the Amsterdam addition, which was added in 1971 between West 64th and 65th Streets, also provides space for elderly and childcare as well as other programs. To wrap things up, the Amsterdam houses is still a vibrant and contributive force on the Upper West Side and formerly San Juan Hill. Testimonies from residents over the years have affirmed the transformative power that quality, affordable housing can have on people's lives. One former resident, Henrietta Edwards, who moved into Amsterdam houses in 1951, stated, quote, "It was heaven to me. My children had a room and I had a room, and we were surrounded by beautiful parks." Stretching back to the early years of San Juan Hill, the project of affordable housing has proven to be a worthwhile investment and something to be vigorously funded and defended. And as a note, it is a particularly prescient moment right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Catch your breath for a second, please. That was great. We covered so much ground, literally and figuratively. If anybody has a question that they'd like to ask, please feel free to do so. I know we've run long, but if everybody wants to stay on for another minute, we have Jessica's brain power of everything and all things free Amsterdam houses and up to Amsterdam houses here. Feel free to raise your hand or chime in. There's been an active chat. A lot of people are meeting former residents and talking about what was there. And we shared some of your prior writing. So hopefully people will look at some of those links as they continue. One question was, when was construction of Amsterdam houses completed?
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by completed, in the sense that these are sort of ever evolving things, but officially 1948.
This is fully occupied, so would that have been around the same time? I know there was a lack of housing.
Yes.
Perfect.
I think so.
That was our sense too, and everybody's always looked at that it was always intended for a Black population, but that because of people returning from the war, that wasn't necessarily the promise that was held true.
Yeah, I think there was quite a disjunction between what was intended and also often sort of marketed to the very vocal Black activists who are, very invested in this versus what, policies actually sort of went into place.
Got it. Someone's commenting that this reminds them of the movie Motherless Brooklyn.
I don't know that one. I think I've heard of it.
Netflix.
Netflix. Okay.
So many people are just expressing their thanks, and I know it's a late hour.
I'm sorry I went on so long. I thought I made it even shorter than last time.
We are hooked. We are hooked. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to follow up with us at landmarkwest@landmarkwest.org, and we will bother Jessica and hound her for right answers. We appreciate all of you for being here tonight. And again, we thank Councilmember Brewer for funding tonight's program. Thank you all. Take care.
Yes, thank you, everyone.